Is there an argument outside of the Bible against homosexual relationships or same-sex relationships or even transgendered relationships? So I think that there is an argument outside of Scripture by looking at nature, by looking, and I don't mean biology necessarily, like out in the woods, but I just mean the natural world. So something other than divine revelation, other than the spiritual realm, just looking at the world around us, I think that we are pre-programmed to be able to see and reason that homosexual relationships are not natural, and by being not natural, they are not right. So in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, Paul talks about that there is an ordering of the world such that we know right from wrong. And so as we observe things around us and certain actions and behaviors, we can see that when someone commits an immoral behavior, we know that person is not acting as they ought to act. And so in the same way, when we look at homosexual relationships, we can see something in them, in that particular relationship and the acts involved, that something is not right about it. It's not as it ought to be. And so when I talk about this idea of oughtness, what I mean is that certain things have a teleology built into them. And that means like an end or a goal, like it's supposed to be a certain way. So a real silly and easy example here is that you don't cook with a hammer, okay? So the hammer is designed and made to be used for a certain function. And you can use it for a different function, but it's not being used as it was intended to. It's going against nature, as it were. And you could look, things are oriented in certain directions and they're supposed to do certain things. And so there's certain ways humans ought to behave, and we can see that in nature. Now, as it relates to homosexual relationships, I think there are three primary things that we can look at in nature to see that these sorts of relationships are unnatural. They're not as they're supposed to be. And that being the case, we would say that is what makes them immoral. So the first one is we'll just call it a biological or an anatomical argument, in that if you line up a male and a female, you can see right away just from an anatomical standpoint that they were fit for one another, that they're almost complementary pairs, one made for the other. And this is something that is so obvious and intuitive, it's almost silly that we even have to say this, but it's the most natural, glaring thing as we look at men and women, that there is this complementarity between them, and one is made for the other and vice versa. They fit together in a very literal sense and in a metaphorical sense as well. They are made to be together. And so to put two men together or two women together, we see naturally, or the way things ought to be, or the way things are oriented towards, goes against that. So it's very unnatural, and hence it would be immoral. It's not the way it's supposed to be. So that's number one, and that's a very, very obvious one. Number two is that if you think about all of the systems that human beings have, the reproductive system is the only system that we can't utilize without the other sex. And a male needs a female and a female needs a male in order for this particular system to be complete or whole. And so the male-female relationship, when it comes together, it's oriented towards reproduction. And that orientation or that goal is blunted, or it's made not possible in a homosexual relationship. So the design or the oughtness of coming together and then reproducing the next generation is not possible. And it's like what the body was designed to do, what the human being was oriented towards, has been severed and made not possible through a homosexual relationship. Okay, and third and finally is that homosexual relationships are not oriented towards bringing forth the next generation or bringing forth offspring. So in a very real sense, they are very self-centered relationships. So male-female relationships, particularly when we're talking getting married, having children, they come together, but then that coming together orients outward and into building families and households and extended families and communities and societies, that sort of thing. And so by nature, by orientation, it is oriented towards flourishing of families and civilizations. So that relationship that comes together then turns outward and serves in many ways outward. And a same-sex relationship, it's sort of the opposite. It turns inward towards each other, and then it stays there because it has no potentiality to flourish beyond itself. So it's a very inward-oriented type of relationship. And as you look about like the long-term benefits or the flourishing for society that relationship brings, it's very, very minimal in comparison to the biological male-female relationship. So it's for these three reasons: just the obvious anatomical differences, the orientation of the male-female together to reproduce, and that being incomplete without one of those male or female components there. And then the actual result of the relationship, one leads to flourishing and outwardness to society, the other does not. It's very inward oriented, and it stays that way. And so for these and many other reasons, we can just see on the face of it, these types of relationships are wrong. They're not the way things are supposed to be. It's oriented in the wrong direction. And when I say wrong, I mean wrong in that you can see that it's not the direction that it's supposed to go. And if you choose to go that way, you're going against nature, against what ought to be. So this is something, just like Paul says in Romans, that we can all see plainly. And when we choose to violate that, we know we're going against what is right and what is good.